This episode is being brought to you in part by Veeva Systems. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. Look, I've talked this to death, but I love SiteVault. It makes our jobs a million times easier, and we get rid of all the paper binders. Maybe one of the things I hate most about what we do at the site level involves lugging around paper binders, paper cuts, jamming these things too full. I hate it. So, SiteVault helps us get rid of that. It helps us easily share our regulatory documents with CRAs and simply makes the job a million times easier. SiteVault's already being used by more than 4,500 sites and more than 400 industry sponsors that also use Veeva's clinical applications. In fact, 65% of global clinical trials run on Veeva. That is a lot of site sponsors and trials. The best part of SiteVault is that it's completely free for sites to use. So it's no risk. Go try it out. Learn more about Veeva SiteVault. Visit sites.veeva.com today. This episode is also being brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site network sponsors, and CROs. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful, user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. Make sure you go check them out, get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com, and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Dan Otap. Dan is a Principal Alliance and Partnerships Lead with Genentech's Research and Early Development Unit. Dan's clinical trial operations and compliance background uniquely positioned him to provide attuned insight into relational site engagement. Dan serves on various internal Roche Genentech work streams related to clinical trial execution and innovation. He also holds positions with the Association of American Cancer Institute as well as Society of Clinical Research Site. Dan's presented at various clinical research conferences. He's authored multiple peer-reviewed publications spanning clinical trial topics ranging from community oncology practices to overall site-sponsor relationships. I've got some more bio for Dan. Make sure to check that out at notetofilepodcast.com. I've been hoping to talk to this guy for a while. I thought it was a really great conversation. We discussed the unnecessary complexity of study startup, the unlikelihood of standardization, the pervasive misalignment of incentives in clinical research, and really so much more. So, again, really a great talk. So without further ado, Dan Otap. All right, Dan Otap. So happy to have you on, man. How's it going?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Right on. Where are you at? Where are you centered?
So I work predominantly remotely, like a lot of us nowadays. So my wife and I just moved to Folsom, California. But the company that I work for, Genentech, is based in South San Francisco. So I'm actually at their campus today. So.
Nice. You guys is there a lot of rain?
There's a little bit of a reprieve right now. But yeah, we've been in kind of a stormy pattern for quite some time now.
Right on. Okay. Enough on the weather talk. Sorry. I'd like to really hit the hard-hitting issues first. But, I want to jump in like I do with every guest, and I like to hear about people's backgrounds, kind of what brought them into the clinical trial space. I think that's always kind of instructive and sometimes fun. So if you would, let's hear your clinical research origin story.
Yeah. Before I even jump in, like we were saying earlier, I just wanted to thank you for having me on this, and I'm definitely looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for giving the time and space. So for me, I'm kind of akin to a lot of people in industry where I kind of stepped in and got involved in clinical trials and in the research space by happenstance, right? So the beginning for me, I was in my master's degree in New York City, and I was approached by a master's cohort colleague who ended up saying, look, you're kind of good at details and you're kind of scientifically minded and oriented. I think you'd be a really good research assistant. I had no idea what that was or what it even entailed, right? So I had to pay bills, newly married in New York City. So we had that going for us. So I ended up taking a position, interviewed, and my first position was at Sloan Kettering, which is a cancer center in New York. And I was involved as a entry-level position, a clinical research study assistant. And it really kind of resonated with me. And being involved in industry-sponsored trials, investigator-initiated studies, NCI-sponsored, et cetera. So I basically started from the ground level. Data entry, regulatory management, binders, patient coordination, you name it, interacting with CRAs and sponsors, et cetera. Did that for a couple of years and kind of moved my way up on the regulatory track into middle management. And then I was recruited to Columbia University by a mentor of mine, Andrew Lastman. So Dr. Lastman was recruited as a new chief of neuro-oncology. So he was going there to rebuild their entire research division, let alone their clinical practice. And he asked me, it was kind of one of those Kevin Costner moments in your career where he was like, we have to rebuild. So how do you want to do this? And if you build it, they'll come, et cetera, right? So it was a huge, huge leap in my career. And we went over to Columbia and kind of rebuilt what their research division looked like, basically from the ground up again, hiring and writing SOPs and taking all the things that I learned from Sloan and applying them to Columbia. Fast forward, very quickly, I ended up being approached by the Cancer Center at Columbia really quickly while we were there. And I had a dual role in the neuro-oncology group as well as the Cancer Center proper. So I really started to cut my teeth with quality assurance, internal monitoring, and auditing, and held a dual role with both managing the neuro-oncology groups and as well as building out this quality assurance team within the Cancer Center. Last position I held there was an associate director of regulatory affairs. So there was a number of groups that I was involved with. Study startup teams, so the regulatory core, an IND office, a multi-center core, so basically an internal study operations team, much akin to like a mini CRO for our investigator-initiated trials, as well as just overall engagement with our investigators and helping them in their sponsor investigator studies. And then the last position I held in the site side was executive director of community practices at City of Hope, which is another cancer center on the West Coast. So after about 9 years at Columbia, I took a position over on the West Coast and looked at how to build research infrastructure in the community practice setting. So that was something that was near and dear to me because of my background growing up in a rural area. So it fit, and it was the next logical step. And then it was kind of fortuitous for me to where I've been working with Genentech in various levels throughout the course of my career, and a position opened up, and I now have a role where I'm a site alliance manager. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what my job entails is trying to figure out how, from a sponsor perspective, to make the working relationship, inclusive of CROs as well as sites and other vendors, very mutually beneficial, if that makes sense, right? So research is complicated. Doing this is complicated, or all of us wouldn't be on these kind of podcasts, but trying to figure out how to make things better. And if I can ultimately be part of a group that helps make sites' lives better, then I know that at the downstream effect, we're making patients' lives better as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Nice. No, I mean, I love that. I always have a soft spot for people who spend a lot of time on sites and sort of the site level. I can't imagine that there's maybe many more valuable, experiences to take if you're going to go work for a big sponsor or CRO or whatever the case may be, other than really seeing that broad and diverse activities that happen at a site. Sites are complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts. There's and I love the role that you have. I think it's really fascinating and something I'd really love to see more across these sponsors. So what does your day-to-day look like? You still get to interact a lot with sites and sort of hear what their experiences are like. I mean, what does that look like?
I do. And I think I'm really quite lucky to be in the group that I'm based in with John Talbot and Camber Gadberry at Genentech. They've been building out groups for site relationship management for years. And as a company, Genentech, every company has its strengths and weaknesses and all these things, right? But as far as site engagement, when I was on the site side, they really kind of differentiated themselves. And I'm not here to sell one company over another, but my experience was very unique. And I felt as if the sponsor was listening, which was huge. Sometimes you just want to know that somebody is listening on the other end, where you're like day in and day out, like you're in the trenches. I don't like that phrase, but you're doing the work that really these trials are. What does my day-to-day look like? I hold a unique space in this group, and I predominantly am focused on building out an early phase oncology network of sites where we partner with these sites that are key institutions with a specific focus on early phase development, right? So it's a little bit different than later phase oncology or later phase drug development in general. That's one of the primary roles that I have. And it's been there for the past 2 years where we're kind of been building out this network, which is now global. It's the Genentech's EON network, which is the expanded oncology network. Again, very industry sponsored in focus, but really partnering with those centers that we want to connect with that we may not have worked with as much, that maybe even other sponsors have worked with more, et cetera. And we hold strategic meetings with those institutions. We have our, scientific exchanges where we're talking about pipeline and upcoming opportunities. The day-to-day for me is a lot of issue escalation, to be honest, right? So if something's bottlenecked, I'm assigned or somebody else is assigned one of those sites, then we're leveraging our relational management capabilities, both internally and externally, to kind of help move things along. Whether it's a miscommunication in regard to whether whose SOP we can follow, CRO or sponsor, et cetera, those kind of dynamics. The other space that I sit in, which is also super unique to me, is Virginia Nido, who works at Genentech Roche, created a group years ago known as Industry Collaborations. And it's actually really unique and beautiful. And it's within Genentech Roche, there are various people that have interests outside and are either on working groups or involved in different groups. Myself, I'm involved in both AACI as well as SCRS, which I'm sure you've talked with many on those fronts. I sit on various committees and groups, and I also represent Roche Genentech in those fields. So that, for me, keeps me very closely connected with the current zeitgeist, if you will, of what's happening with sites. Because like we said, I have a pretty deep understanding, especially when it comes to oncology and NCI designated cancer centers and how to run matrix cancer centers and do those trials. But having the position that keeps me connected with the AACIs and the SCRS groups really still enables me to be fresh. So I find myself to be very blessed and lucky, if you will, to be honest, because it keeps me engaged in the current topics, whether it be tech burden or even, down to budgetary nuances and DCT nuances, things like that.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I feel like it's not something I've seen a lot. Do you think that's unique to oncology maybe, or something that could be more broadly implemented across other therapeutic areas?
Yeah. You make a good point with that. And what I would say is Onc has a deep pipeline regardless of a sponsor, right? So that, they're rare diseases in many aspects, but still you're going to have a deep pipeline with, lung cancers, prostate, breast, et cetera. So it makes sense for companies in a lot of ways to build those types of alliance partnerships. And some go all the way to like formal clinical trial agreement, master agreement contracts, et cetera. Then some are a little bit more fit for purpose, like this EON effort that we're doing, where in a lot of ways, it's really partnering with like-minded sites and investigators. When you go outside of oncology, it gets a little bit more nuanced, if you will, right? So you can do this for things like ophthalmology or respiratory, which Genentech is focusing on. But when you have these super rare diseases where your non-oncology pipeline for these biotechs or other big pharma, you may have a trial in a specific indication, but you might not have another trial in that indication for years to come. So build out that type of alliance network. Sometimes I think it's a little bit more difficult to do. Oncology, it fits, right? And it makes sense, but it definitely is something that we've seen value add, and it has started to kind of, work its way into other areas and therapeutic indications where it makes sense, right? Like I had the pleasure of traveling for this role, and I was at a couple centers in Israel last year. And while I was talking about oncology, we dovetailed those discussions, and I met with a host of individuals that were in the ophthalmology space as well as the respiratory space. You can also see the same thing happening in like neurology as well.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I feel like, we work in oncology. It's relatively new still for us, but it did kind of strike me, even from the beginning, there seems to be a lot more touch points between site and sponsor, a lot more, I guess, relationship building versus like, here's a feasibility survey. Good luck, send it back. Maybe you'll hear from us. And instead you've got multiple conversations with MSLs from various backgrounds and big calls with the PI. And, again, that kind of struck me. But to your point, it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about, you need that relationship if you're going to have such a broad and deep pipeline, to really be able to be successful. I think we undervalue relationships anyway, but this is an area where I think it's especially important. So it makes sense in a lot of ways. And certainly, again, something I found interesting, like right off the bat when we started sort of getting a little bit deeper into the oncology space.
Yeah, even in that, and I couldn't agree with you more as far as the aspect of the relational component, right? Because when we're talking about drug development and clinical trials, a lot of the times we look at numbers more than anything. And even especially when it comes from the sponsor side, they have a lot of pressures with clinical development plans, timelines, and budgets, and they have to do a lot of answering to milestones, et cetera. But there is an aspect of all this that if we keep the main thing, relationships make the world go around, and inclusive of both personal level as well as professional, in my opinion. And yeah, oncology might feel more robust than others, but I would also respond with saying that I'm of the notion that we could probably do a heck of a lot better, even in that space, right? Like with study startup in general. It just, but it rises and falls on a relationship aspect where it's everything from just trust building over time, right? Like if I work with your center, I want to make sure that you're aware that at the end of the day, we have the best interest in mind, patient driven, science driven, but we also want to be good business partners, right? Like at the end of the day, like everybody's got to pay rent or their mortgage or something. So keeping the human aspect of all this front and center, I think, is also super valuable. And that's hard to quantify. And if you think about it, sometimes it's even hard to justify, having that type of focus where people want to come back and say, well, what's your return on investment? Now, there are clearly thought leaders in this space that have the ability of doing kind of KPI management of this type of thing. But I will say that I've never heard a site come back to me saying, this isn't a big priority. But it is very hard sometimes when you're in the boardrooms, et cetera, to make sure that you can continue to justify one's own existence. It's very Kierkegaardian, if you will, like very existential at times. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's oftentimes feel like it's more art than science for sure. Yeah, I'm with you in that regard. And something you touched on there, that's we talked about before taping is the study startup process, right? Mm. So you had your foot in kind of both sides now.
Yeah.
Sites, it's certainly pretty clear to us that study startup is less than optimal.
Yeah.
as I'm sure the sponsor side would agree as well. And then sometimes you throw a CRO into the mix. What can we do? It's crazy because when you really break it down, I feel study startup's not that complicated. Mm-hmm. When you really look at the individual pieces, right? If I need to make an IRB submission, I can do that in literally 10 minutes.
Yes.
To a central IRB. But, first of all, I need to know that the subject compensation's been negotiated, and I need to know all these other things. I want to at least get, a little bit into the process before I commit to going through the trouble. Anyways, there's a host of problems that exist. So what have you seen, and where do we kind of go from here? What are we doing?
So this is, you hit on a topic that's actually pretty near and dear to me, right? Both eminently in my current position at Genentech, where we're really trying to look at how we do site activation and country activation. We do a lot of outsourcing for our studies. So we do, in the early phase space, leverage our CRO partners. And we're really trying to look at how we revamp this. You said something that made me smile because you're right. It's the analogy that I've been using, and I even posted this on LinkedIn late last year, probably like October last year. The analogy that I'm trying to look at as far as study activation is concerned is the concept of a Rube Goldberg machine. So if you remember these things are like, and honestly, when I nerd out on this kind of stuff, I love it. it's a system or a machine that's created, which actually is just a combination of basically the 6 basic machines, levers, etc. But they're done in such a way that it's like a ball is dropped on the left side and it goes all the way through. And there's so many things going on, and it's very intricate. And a boot swings this way, and a bucket drops water this way. But at the end of the day, it's really something that's executing a simplistic thing, right? Like a bell rings at the end of these kind of things. But it's beautiful to look at. But at the beginning of it, when you're looking at all this, it's super complicated. It's nauseatingly complicated. So for some of us that like to kind of look at these things and find the beauty in it, that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, when I'm talking about study startup, that's how I see startup right now. I see it as, in a lot of ways, that very intricate, very complex, but a process that seems overly complex in a lot of ways. And we can go into so many different discussions there with whether it be e-doc exchange or the way that the contracts and budgets are negotiated and portals that are leveraged for our JDs to go in and redline, to the way that we have master CTAs, let alone master CDAs. Like this clearly, I started in 2009. Study startup was a problem in 2009. It was a pain point in 2009, probably well before my time and your time. And it still is top of mind, right? And what's interesting for me is being, and you have a lot of speakers on your podcast that have this kind of career narrative and journey where they've been on multiple sides of the discussion. I've been on the site very deeply for years. I'm now on the sponsor side, and each of us have our own kind of pain points, right? I would love to see a point in the future where, and I think this actually goes back to your comment about relationships. I would like to see a point in the future where, in a lot of ways, we can take learnings from the just-in-time models that are out there. And the analogy that I'd like to see is take that Rube Goldberg type complexity machine and create a position of study activation and site activation where it's akin to, nowadays, you push a button in your vehicle and it starts, your ignition turns over. It doesn't mean that process to start your car is any less complex. And in fact, it's even more complex than it was historically. But what's happening under the hood now is so well orchestrated that you can push a button and your car starts. I would love to somehow figure out, and in fact, I'm open to those conversations, to figure out how do we get there with activation, especially if we have sites such as yourself or others that we've had multiple studies with. We're going to continue to have multiple studies with you. It's almost as if there's got to be, and I'm one voice amongst many, and there are many solutions that are proffered there. There's platforms created. There's initiatives that are created. But one amongst many saying that there's got to be an easier way here. I'm not in any way, shape, or form downplaying the level of complexity that goes into activating a study, both at the site level as well as even more so on the sponsor level. If it's a global study, you have a lot of nuances and things that need to be taken into consideration. The vendors that you're partnering with, like there's a lot of things that are going on. Different materials are being created, especially if you're in an early phase space. I don't know about you, but I remember sitting on the site side saying we had welcome letters. Like a Brad Bott, who was my former director at Columbia for a time, when I first took over in regulatory, said, look, Dan, think of this as a mutual agreement and pact where let's present to the CRO and the sponsor what you need to get your study rolling and submitted, give it to them in paper. And I thought, well, this is brilliant. It's so simple. Well, guess what? Now anybody who's anybody now is doing this reflexively, and you're sending out this, it's almost like you're sending an acceptance of the award letter of thanks so much for doing a PSV. Congratulations, you're accepted into this study. And, you get those nice award letters. It's almost now you kind of got like the return letter saying, wonderful, thanks for selecting us. This is what we need to get going. And you also, in a lot of ways, have sites that are, like you said, you've created a system where you have staff and others who can submit things in like 10 minutes, right? Like, again, it's more complicated than that, but it is
Sure.
simplistic in some realms. Like, hey, I need an ICF, I need an IB, I need the contract and budget template, I need the manuals. just give me the damn manuals. Why? Not because we just need to look at making sure that we can cover the costs and budget accordingly. Like if you're going to have assays or blood draws or PKs, et cetera, that are PBMC and require us to do it on site, that's a whole different discussion than a whole blood draw. You pull the whole tube, send it off in ambient. We know these things, right? Like this isn't rocket science. This is still science, but it's not rocket science. But still to this day, as recent as even a recent post that you had, I think about 3 months ago or so, talking about, different portals and different groups working on the same study, engaging with sites and their different teams. You have a legal team and a budget team, finance, and then they're completely devoid of who's working on the IXRS setup and your imaging. There's some beauty in the complexity, but then there's also some absurdity in the complexity. And I think it comes down to, I love Occam's razor and the principle of parsimony, like just trying to make this as simplistic as possible. I could clearly talk about this all day long, so forgive me if I'm rambling, but there's got to be a way of making that complex system, which is important and complex in and of itself, everything from the budget all the way to human subjects protection, right? That's why we all do what we're doing. We're trying to figure out if these medications are going to potentially work and also not do any additional top of mind. So it's important, but I still think I would love a process that is just as complex, but give me that ignition button, like that, the start. And I don't know what that looks like. I know that it might be just a cohort of sites, right? Like maybe just, because also there's something to be said here in quasi post COVID, if you will, where all of our lives changed on a personal level as well as professional level, and our priorities changed. You even see this in like the workforce narrative. We're looking at more hybrid approaches or different kind of benefits that keep people in seats at work. And, everything changed. I'll tell you, for early phase trials, the first thing out of the gate that I'm concerned with is how long is it going to take you as a site to activate the study? Why? Not because I'm trying to be greedy. I literally am looking at this from a project management perspective saying, these studies are so advanced in their statistics and the way that they're designed nowadays that you and I both know a lot of these early phase studies that are dose escalation end up having expansion cohorts, especially in the onc space, have expansion cohorts, and you're really replacing a phase 2 nowadays, right? Like you're using a phase 1 that's an adaptive design using Bayesian methodology, et cetera. And you're really creating a seamless drug development system, which is beautiful in regard to a sponsor's ability to get to the questions faster, but it it creates a lot of complexity for the sites on the back end, right? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you touched on a lot of things there, but certainly something I've been thinking more and more about lately. But I mean, do you think, as you kind of mentioned, look, we we sort of know what we need, right, in terms of the study startup process. You talk about Rube Goldberg machine, and I'm thinking like it's like playing mousetrap.
Mm-hmm.
You set up the board only to know now it's like every time there's somewhere it stops, somewhere it's broken, right, and you got to re-roll and start back over again. But we know the components that we need. Are we suffering from a lack of standardization, perhaps? I mean, could it be as simple as just creating a standard by which we all agree upon, knowing, again, that we all need these things? Because as it stands, at the site level, we're small, we're very flat. We still have trouble getting the things we need to know what we need to do the things we need to do, if that makes sense. It's even more challenging where, I've been in a university where there's the finance. I've never talked to the finance guy in my life. He's over here negotiating budgets. I got no idea who the guy is. And, your operations are somewhere else. Your IRB coordinator is, in another office. That's one thing. But even where I've set out to be flat on purpose, it's incredibly challenging. So again, are we just shooting ourselves in the foot by not adapting to some sort of standardization? And is that a result of, I don't even know what it would be a result of. Why can't we do that? It seems intuitive enough, right?
I mean, it does seem intuitive, right? And I think that one could it depends on the type of mentality that you take when you look at that question. You could be super pessimistic and super negative and look at things like job security. if something's complex, it takes a lot of people, right? So, but that I think is a little bit too much of a back of the envelope thought process. So let's keep the glass half full, if you will, on this conversation. I think it has to do with competition in this space. I think, interestingly enough, all of the sponsors, I don't want to speak for every sponsor or CRO, but this is a problem that's universal, right? I don't think anybody has cracked the proverbial egg and learned how to scramble this egg perfectly and make a beautiful omelet every time or whatever. It just doesn't happen, right? You have your one-offs and your early wins, but it's not scalable and it's not, I mean, we deal in research, right? So it's not reproducible. I think that we are at an inflection point in regard to how we all operate, where out of a necessity, sponsors need to start listening more and being willing and open to really actually taking heed to what's being told to them, predominantly by the sites, and also ensuring that their partnership, if we do outsource, like we do a lot, being mindful that we want to engage our CRO partners and have the same goals and priorities in mind, and keeping the North Stars, like our patients and our site staff, that we couldn't do what we do without sites, right? Like that's what's the interesting thing. Standardization, I think, with different efforts like Transcelerate and others, and you know, we were chatting about the shared investigator platform and these kind of things. I don't know what it's going to take to create standardization across sponsors as well as CROs and the like. I think that there's a pretty knee-jerk, easy response to say, well, you mentioned you had some experience from the university side, now you're standalone centers. There's a huge difference between a large academic medical center versus your site networks. There's a huge difference between oncology, like we were talking about earlier, as opposed to, you know, COPD type infrastructure and those. There's always going to be an excuse. And I don't say excuse in the realm of trying to be, again, negative about this. There's always going to be a retort on how, well, this is unique or this is different. I think we do need to figure out a way. And honestly, clearly, and I think this is a topic that you talk about a lot sometimes too, is there's clearly also vendors and platforms that are trying to answer this for everybody as well. So it's clearly a hot button space.
Well, and yeah, I mean, there's, I like, oh yeah, where you're going there. I mean, a lot of good points already, but like, look, it's different, but it's not, right?
Agreed.
At the same time. So, and look, I'm obviously have been a big voice for sites and their ability to do things the way they want. But, you know, the more I even come around on the idea of like, also sites need to be willing to, I don't know if fall in line is the right way to put it, but I think they need to be willing to sacrifice some of their independence in a way in order to help make this smoother for everybody. Because, you know, just like you say, I mean, every model's different, but at the same time, we can't have 100 sites doing things 100 different ways, which is essentially what we have, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, as much as, again, I'm all for sites' rights or whatever you want to call it, look, we're just as much a part of the problem. You know, I can't imagine being a sponsor or a CRO and dealing with 100 different people and having to do it 100 different ways. So, you know, in a lot of ways, I think sites can be just as guilty of holding up that process. That's where I'm beginning to sort of come around more to the idea of like, look, let's get on the same page, and look, it's not going to be that you get to do everything exactly the way you want to every single time, but it could be better for, you know, the bigger picture here.
I think so. Here's an interesting point that was raised. I believe it was Sean Soth from SCRS that's mentioned this before from a business standpoint. And I'm not advocating for one group over another, et cetera. But we all sit in a very unique space where our livelihood is dependent on the other's livelihood, even more so than I think any other space that I can think of. I said before, like we as sponsors need our investigators and sites. Otherwise, we don't have a foot to stand on. We don't get the questions answered, right? So that's why I do like mentioning like patients labeled as participants, et cetera, and then investigators being partners, site staff being partners. I think it's heightened in our day-to-day jobs and roles, more so than any other industry, where we are truly mutually dependent on one another. If we don't have new molecules, you don't have new studies. If you don't have the bandwidth of opening any new studies, we can't activate our studies to get our molecule questions answered. And if you're struggling, it'll impact your ability to activate studies. It'll impact your ability to enroll participants, impact your ability to present and enter quality data so that we can get the answers that we're looking for. It's all intertwined. It's quite impressive when you take a step back to look at just how bidirectionally and sometimes quadridirectionally, or whatever you want to call it, with CROs and vendors, et cetera, how we are all clearly dependent on another person. I mean, it's quite astounding for me to look at it and see where if we sometimes miss the forest for the trees, because at the end of the day, if one party in this discussion is hurting, it affects the other parties, not even indirectly, directly.
Yeah, and so I don't disagree, but to go back to a point you just kind of touched on a little earlier, do you think it's disproportionate? I mean, if one side is, if one side's paid in billable hours and the other side is only paid for in patients that have been enrolled, doesn't that create a little bit of a misalignment? I mean, in terms of who's going to really want efficiency more? And if so, is that a problem, or is it a problem that can be overcome?
Yeah, I like kind of where you're going with that, because it does seem like at times certain things could be diametrically opposed. And I completely can see that, especially with, covering one's books and time and effort, et cetera, and how you balance your profit and loss, et cetera. I definitely get that and respect that. Maybe I'm the hopeful cynic, if you will, that would look at it and say, there are intricacies here that we might not be drilling down into, but there's got to be something that comes up to the surface. And again, and I've seen this in posts or white papers or even just editorials or different write-ups on this topic. There is such a thing as like a clinical trial business as well, right? That's sometimes shied away from because it's like, oh, well, we want to make sure that we're in this for the greater good and we want to be here for the patients above all else. But at the end of the day, these are also businesses. So I think, yes, there could be diametrically opposed needs, but I think that that's part of the discussion that needs to happen, because I don't think anybody is out to, and this is me, Dan Otap, saying this, I don't think you walk into a budget negotiation as a site thinking, I'm going to squeeze this sponsor for as much as I possibly can because this is going to get me my new Ferrari, right? It's just not it's just not what happens. Or to make it more realistic, this is going to get me an additional 2 or 3 FTEs, right? Like, it's just not how it is. But flip side, I also, and again, I think it is a little bit misaligned and definitely misweighted, but I don't see the sponsors also saying, well, I'm going to squeeze the site and nickel and dime them. And if we are doing that, we've missed the forest for the trees, right? Because it does us no good to be penny wise and pound foolish. It just doesn't. That's a hard discussion to make. And again, that's me coming from my own standpoint, right? So that's not me speaking on behalf of any company, et cetera. But sure. I think that if we become super, super in the weeds as far as, fair market value plus 20% or 90th percentile high, that gets super cumbersome. And in fact, I'm sure you've had others on this, and I can think of names off the top of my head that could speak to this much more eloquently than I, but we lose a lot of time there. That's part of the discussion as far as startup is concerned. And you're like, dude, I just need my overhead covered. That's it. I'm not looking to fleece you. It's like more complicated than that.
It is, but we go back, bringing it back. Well, first of all, I'll say one more thing. I mean, I do think, I don't know that there's necessarily any, to your point, malicious intent in the way things oftentimes feel weighted one direction. Obviously you can see CROs are public companies. You can see what their revenue is. There aren't a lot of sites out there. I don't know if there's any publicly listed research networks out there that are, balling out the way that CROs are. But that aside, to your point, that process does oftentimes, that's a lot of the killer in a lot of these study startup processes, and simple communication can be the difference maker there. I mean, look, we will just pick up the phone and call and say, hey, what can you do here? Or what, let's be reasonable and just talk this out instead of shooting an email, waiting for a response for a week. Oh no, I don't like that. Let me put in my my request, send it back, wait another week. Again, they seem like simple solutions, right? But they start stacking and they get infinitely more complex.
Yeah. And there you go with that analogy that we're talking about with that Rube Goldberg system, right? Like I think it's inadvertently created a system that's super complex, but we're still trying to execute in a quasi way, something that's pretty straightforward, right? But I think to go back to what we were chatting about earlier, that I think really has an anchor to all this, which is why I'm in the role that I'm in and why I enjoy coming to work every day, is it rises and falls in the relationship aspect, right? Like if I know and I have a level of trust built between you and I, we can move things very quickly. Even if there's a sticking point and we know that one another is going to have the best of intentions, that goes a long way. And when you have partners in business and partners in life, et cetera, that are willing to go to bat for you and willing to even sit and listen again and really have a bi-directional, mutually beneficial relationship, you might not see eye to eye on everything. That's also the beauty here, right? Like we might not be able, but you're putting your best foot forward. And I think that goes back to all this, like cracking the code here. I don't know if it's a platform or some type of e-doc exchange, et cetera, but I think part of this discussion that is going to help truly crack this code is really when we look at the brass tacks of it all, it's the human aspect. Because everybody has their own drivers, everybody has their own pressures. CROs have their pressures, sponsors, sites, and it's a matter of truly communicating where we can find some mutual agreement and grounding. I think that's going to be a huge component. I know that that's not sexy or savvy or anything because I'm saying, oh, it's a relationship. But I really do. I would take that to the bank all day. I know that if this thing is going to work and we are going to create a system where we can have that type of ignition starting point for study activation, that engine is complicated. Doesn't simplify that. It doesn't at all. But I think that you could truly get to that level. And one of the rising tenets to really get there will be, and always will be, that thread of the human aspect of the relationship management.
Yeah, no, and again, the longer I do this, I mean, I get embarrassed that I still have to keep learning this lesson, but it does feel like the things that really success hinge upon are oftentimes not necessarily the big, sexy, scalable things. Like you said, yeah. I mean, it is sometimes as simple as a relationship. Because I've used studies with platforms, without platforms, and it doesn't seem to matter. They can be great or terrible on a platform. They can be great or terrible via email exchange. But sometimes if I can just pick up the phone and talk through something with someone, we can get it done in 5 minutes. What would have otherwise taken 4 weeks? And it can be as simple as that. Now, can they have that conversation with 150 sites? I don't know. It may not be that easy again, but that's, again, not sexy. People don't want to necessarily maybe admit it, but and that's sometimes as simple as that.
Yeah. And just because it would be simple doesn't mean it's necessarily easy, or it still will take a lot of work. So
well, that's true. Well, we clearly have, look, that's the beauty, right? I mean, there's still a lot of things to figure out. I mean, that is why it's such an exciting space to still be in, because there's still so much room for efficiency, right? I mean, it's for better or worse, it's a big open field in a lot of ways. And there's still a lot of work to be done, that should keep us all excited for years to come.
Yeah. I couldn't think of a better job to have, because at the end of the day, no matter what role we're playing here, I truly believe when it comes to clinical operations and clinical trials, especially interventional therapeutic studies, we're all wanting to be part of something that's much bigger than ourselves. And we all want to be a small part of potentially helping others. We all know the failure rates of these molecules. It's kind of like a unicorn, right? To get one approved. But if I can be part of, at least day in and day out, trying to be one of many, including yourself and others that have been on your podcast, et cetera, that we're all looking towards wanting to make the world a little bit better. As kumbaya as that sounds, it literally, if you cut me, that's what I'd lead. Like, it's something that has become a passion. I think all of us that are in this, whether we got into industry or in clinical trials by happenstance, like I said, I had to pay bills, New York City, et cetera. It's become a career. And really, it's more than anything, it's being part of something that's bigger than yourself. I honestly can't think of a better job. It's harder. It's hard as all get out. I remember, the long data locks and being up late at the site. I remember being the one to be the last one in the elevator out the door. And then I remember having staff being those staying late. Like, it's a job. It's a lot of involvement, but I don't think I'd want to be part of anything else. As cliche as it sounds, it's a good place to be. And I think we're all in a very worthwhile and valuable kind of industry. So,
yeah, I mean, I like to think that's a common ground that a lot of us have. And I tell people all the time, if I wanted to get rich, I surely would have chosen a different industry to be in.
Yeah.
So the motivation has to be at least a little altruistic, I think, to stick it out, because you're right, man. It's challenging. It's frustrating at times. It can beat you down, but ultimately we all have to keep marching ahead for patients, for ourselves, for our families, for everyone that will be touched by the work that we do, which, let's face it, is pretty much everybody, right?
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Well, very good, Dan. Where can people find you online?
So I have a small presence on LinkedIn. That's about it. You can look me up on LinkedIn and I can connect with folks there. I'm not as savvy as yourself, but I definitely am open to discussions and love to connect as much as possible, especially on the topic of activation right now. I think that's something that I'm very keen on partnering and listening to sites as well as CROs and other partner sponsors. In my opinion, in a lot of ways, it's a non-competitive space. So LinkedIn is probably the best. I would say, yeah. Other than that, I don't have that much of an online presence, if you will.
Fair enough. Well, I'll make sure and drop that in the show notes so people can reach out. And anything else before we sign off here?
No, I mean, just like I started out, and this truly is heartfelt. I'm very grateful for what you've created in this space. I think it's generally being curious and willing to listen and creating a space for individuals such as yourself, others, and myself to really just talk things through. It's been a joy to see this grow, and I'm very, very flattered, and I consider myself lucky to even be on your podcast. So I just wanted to say thanks again, and thanks again for even creating this space. I think it really is needed, and there's clearly have hit on something that is resonating with a lot of others. So, yeah.
I appreciate that. You're welcome on back anytime. And, I look forward to seeing how these conversations continue to evolve. I tell people, like, look, I'm a lot of people out there smarter than me. So if I can just get the conversation going, I think we can work through this stuff. I mean, I am hopeful, just like you. I'm a cynic in a lot of ways, but I'm also an optimist. I think we can work through this stuff. It's not going to be easy. It might be painful, but, I think we have to keep marching along. We'll get there.
Agreed. Thanks again so much.
Yeah, thank you, man. We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Dan. As always, thank you so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. Make sure and check out our previous 75 episodes as well as our live stream at notetofilepodcast.com. Also, if you made it all the way to the end, we are putting on the Save Our Sites conference in February 2024, so check out saveoursites.com. If you buy a ticket and shoot me an email at brad@hightowerclinical.com, I'll send you out a free shirt. So, limited time only. If you're listening to this, get at me. I'll get you some free merch. Thanks again for listening, guys.